The winter wind came crawling down from the high country, carrying with it the kind of cold that could turn a man's bones to glass. Snow hissed against the boards of Eli Carter's barn, piling thick along the roof and fence posts. Out here, 10 miles from the nearest town and a good half-day's ride from any neighbor, silence wasn't just peaceful, it was heavy, like the land itself was holding its breath. Eli had been mending a busted harness under the dim glow of a lantern when he heard it, just a faint noise at first. A thump, then a moan. Sounded like one of the cattle might have slipped. He grabbed his coat, lit another lantern, and stepped out into the storm. The snow was blinding, the kind that swirled sideways and bit at any bit of exposed skin. He pushed the barn door open and paused. The horses snorted nervously. The lantern light caught something strange near the far stall, a dark bundle crumpled against the hay bales. At first, Eli thought it might be an animal, but when he stepped closer, his breath caught in his throat. It was a woman. She was half buried under a tattered shawl. Her dress soaked through, her lips blue as the twilight sky. Her boots were caked with snow and her hands trembled like leaves in a gale. For a long second, Eli just stood there, trying to piece together what in God's creation a lady was doing out here in the middle of a blizzard. He crouched beside her and touched her shoulder. "Ma'am, you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open, green, glassy, distant. She tried to speak, but only a soft whimper came out. "Easy now," Eli said, sliding his coat off and wrapping it around her. "Let's get you warm." He lifted her, surprised at how light she was, and carried her across the barn to the tack room. He kicked the door shut against the cold, set her down near the stove, and stoked the coals until the fire began to bite the chill from the air. Her clothes were near frozen, so he found an old wool blanket from the loft and draped it over her. She shivered violently, still half unconscious. Eli fetched a kettle, poured her a tin cup of warm water, and held it to her lips. When she finally managed to sip, she whispered, "Please, don't send me back." Eli frowned. "Send you back where, ma'am?" Her eyes darted up at him, and for the first time, he saw fear in them, deep, raw fear. "To him," she said, her voice cracking. "To my husband." The words hit Eli like a cold slap. He knew every rancher within 20 miles, and there weren't many women among them. Only one man around here had taken a wife recently, Tom Hasker, his neighbor to the south. Tom was a hard man, mean with his words, meaner with his hands. Folks in town whispered about the way he treated his stock, and how his new breed, a mail-order girl from St. Louis, hadn't been seen much since she'd come west. Eli swallowed hard, looking at the fragile woman in front of him. "You're Tom's wife, ain't you?" She didn't answer, just looked away. Tears welling in her eyes, Eli let out a long breath and pulled his hat off, rubbing the back of his neck. "All right," he muttered. "Ain't no law says I gotta send you anywhere tonight. You'll stay here till we figure this out." Outside, the wind howled across the plains like a chorus of ghosts. Inside the barn, the fire crackled, throwing long shadows across the walls. Eli sat on an upturned crate, his rifle resting against his knee. He couldn't shake the feeling that before the night was over, trouble was bound to find its way through that snow. And sure enough, somewhere out in the dark, a distant horse whinnied, followed by the faint echo of a man's voice calling her name. The first light of dawn barely cut through the storm clouds, but the wind had eased, leaving the prairie coated in white like a frozen sea. Eli Carter rode slowly along the edge of his ranch, the snow crunching beneath his horse's hooves. The woman Mary, as she'd whispered in the night, was safe in the barn, wrapped in blankets and finally quiet in sleep. But peace was a fleeting thing in the west. Eli knew Tom Hasker would be on the move. The man had a temper that could set the prairie on fire, and Tom had reasons to look for his bride. Eli had faced down rustlers, coyotes, and one too many barroom brawls. But this was different. This wasn't about cattle or land, it was about a human life. And Eli had decided, right then, that he wouldn't send Mary back to the kind of man who could leave her shivering in a storm. He spurred his horse toward the Hasker place. Tom's ranch was only a few miles south, but in the snow and wind, it felt like 100. Eli knew the man well enough to anticipate his movements. If Tom had discovered his bride missing, he'd ride hard, yelling and threatening, ready to take her back by force. Eli dismounted near a clump of scrub oaks that overlooked the Hasker corral. From this vantage, he could see the smoke curling from the cabin's chimney, a sure sign that someone was home. But there was no sign of Tom yet, only the horses in the corral, stamping and pawing at the frozen ground. Eli leaned against a tree, scanning the horizon. Mary had told him little, just that Tom had been cruel, though he'd hidden the worst of it under promises and charm. But that brief confession was enough. Eli's jaw tightened. Out here, a man who treated a woman like property was a man who deserved a reckoning. A shadow passed across the snow rider. Fast and hard. Eli's hand went to his revolver, but he didn't raise it. He waited. The figure slowed as it came into view, and sure enough, it was Tom Hasker. Hat low, eyes blazing, a whip coiled at his side. "Mary," Tom's voice cut across the still morning like a whip crack. "Mary, you're coming back." Eli stepped from behind the oaks, calm but unyielding. "Not today, Tom. She's stayin' with me." Tom stopped in his tracks, staring at Eli like he'd just been handed a rattlesnake. "You ain't got no say in this, Carter. That woman belongs to me." Eli's grip on his revolver relaxed slightly. "Not anymore. And out here, property laws don't cover cruelty. You treat people right. You earn their trust. You don't. You get left behind in the snow." Tom sneered. "You think you can stop me?" Eli didn't answer. He let the wind carry the sound of his spurs against the snow. Then, without warning, he swung his leg over his horse and spurred it into a trot. Tom hesitated, then followed, both men riding hard across the frozen prairie, leaving a trail of hoofprints in the white. Eli didn't aim to kill Tom, not yet, but he had a plan. He knew a series of ridges a few miles east that would break the line of sight. Give Mary a chance to escape if the man got too close. By the time they reached the first ridge, Eli's thoughts were clear. This wasn't just about stopping a man. It was about proving a simple truth. Even in a land as harsh as this, kindness and courage could still carve out a little justice. From the ridge, Eli glanced back. Tom's horse pawed the ground, angry and restless, and his rider shouted curses that echoed across the valley. But Eli kept his focus forward, toward safety, toward the barn, toward the woman who had trusted him in the storm. It wasn't a battle yet. It was a warning. And Eli intended to make sure Tom Hasker understood that some debts in the West couldn't be paid with money, or land, or even fists. Some debts had to be paid with honor. As they rode down the far side of the ridge, Eli felt the first stirring of relief. The snow was starting to fall again, light and feathery, hiding their tracks. If they could make it another few miles, the Hasker place would fade behind them, and Mary would have a chance at something she'd never had before. A choice. And out here, choice was worth more than all the cattle in the county. Mary's fate hung in the balance. And Eli knew the West was a place where courage was measured not in guns, but in the willingness to stand up when no one else would. The snow had settled into a soft, powdery blanket over Eli Carter's ranch by the time he returned with Mary. The barn smelled of hay, horses, and the faint tank of wood smoke, a comfort she had never known before. She sat on a bale, wrapped tightly in blankets, her hands rubbing the warmth back into her fingers. For the first time in days, she didn't shiver. Eli crouched beside her. "You're safe here," he said quietly. More statement than promise. "We'll figure out what comes next." Mary's eyes were wary, the kind of wariness that comes from learning the hard truth too young, that men can be cruel. And the world even crueler. "Why? Why are you helping me?" she asked softly, voice trembling. Eli scratched at the stubble on his chin, avoiding her gaze for a moment. "Ain't right. What happened to you? Can't stand by and let it keep happening." She nodded slowly, unsure whether to trust him, but the warmth of the fire, the steady presence of the horses, and the faint smell of leather and wood smoke had a grounding effect. She took a hesitant breath. "I don't know how to live out here. I've never—" Her voice faltered, and she looked down at the rough floorboards. "Never done anything for myself." Eli smiled faintly, a glimmer of humor softening his rugged features. "Out here, you learn fast. The West don't wait for folks to get ready." Over the next few days, Eli began showing Mary the rhythms of ranch life. How to feed the horses, how to chop wood without losing a finger, how to mend a fence in the wind. She was clumsy at first, hands blistered, knees bruised, but her determination surprised him. Mary had a quiet strength, the sort that didn't make noise but made its presence felt. One evening, after a day of hauling hay, Eli led her outside. The sun was setting behind distant ridges, casting long shadows across the snow-covered plains. "You see that ridge?" he asked. "That's where we're safe from anyone poking around. Can't hide forever, but it buys us time." Mary's breath puffed in the cold air. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Eli looked away, embarrassed by the sentiment. Ain't nothing to it, just doing what's right. But he knew better. Out here, doing right often meant putting yourself in danger. Tom Hasker had not forgotten. Word traveled fast across the plains, and Eli could feel the tension mounting. Every creak of the barn door, every distant shout on the wind, set him on edge. Mary noticed it too. One evening, as they fed the horses, she hesitated and said, "Eli, do you think he'll come?" Eli paused, considering the distant horizon. "Maybe, but if he does, he'll find it ain't the same as taking a scared girl off the street. This girl's got someone watching her back now." Mary smiled faintly, warmth spreading through her despite the chill. For the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. The West was harsh, and life could be cruel, but there was a chance she could survive it. Even thrive. As the days passed, a routine formed. Mornings were for chores, afternoons for the horses, evenings by the fire with stories. Eli spoke little of his past, but Mary listened intently, learning about the man behind the rugged exterior, the one who had faced droughts, rust, and hard winters without ever losing his sense of justice. Mary began to feel stronger, more capable. She could ride, she could cook simple meals over the fire, and she even managed to patch a fence without cutting herself. She laughed for the first time in weeks, a soft sound that carried across the barn, mixing with the scent of hay and smoke. One night, as the stars stretched across the clear, frosty sky, Mary whispered, Do you think I can stay here, for good?" Eli looked at her, heart hammering against his ribs. "That's up to you, Mary. Ain't no one can decide for you but yourself, but if you want, you're welcome to stay." And in that moment, surrounded by the vast, unforgiving plains, Mary felt a fragile sense of belonging. The West was still wild, still dangerous, but it held a promise she hadn't dared hope for, a new life, on her own terms, with someone she could trust. Eli watched her curl up by the fire, the light casting shadows across her face. He knew the threat of Tom Hasker hadn't disappeared, but for now, they had this safety, warmth, and the quiet bond of two people carving out a life where once there had been only cold and fear. The West was relentless, and the road ahead uncertain, but sometimes, just sometimes, even in the harshest land, beginnings could bloom. Mary was starting to believe she could survive the West, but trouble always had a way of catching up, especially when a man like Tom Hasker was involved. The prairie was quiet, the kind of quiet that set Eli Carter's nerves on edge. Even the horses seemed uneasy, stamping their hooves and flicking their ears toward the distant ridges. Winter was still biting, and the snow that had fallen days ago now glittered like shards of glass beneath the weak sun. Eli rode the perimeter of his ranch, eyes scanning the horizon. He'd hoped that Tom Hasker would give up, that the man's temper would fade with the miles between them. But in the West, a stubborn man with a grudge could ride through snow, hail, or darkness without hesitation. And Eli knew Tom was exactly that kind of man. Back at the barn, Mary moved with a newfound confidence, feeding the horses and mending torn blankets. She had begun to trust the rhythm of this place, the safety Eli provided, but there was still a shadow in her eyes whenever the wind howled through the cracks in the barn walls. Eli returned to the barn with a frown etched deep into his sunburned face. "You see that ridge?" he said, pointing toward a distant rise. "I don't like the look of it. Been watchin' the shadows, and I swear I saw someone moving out there yesterday." Mary froze, heart skipping a beat. "Do you think it's him?" Eli nodded grimly. "Could be. And if it is, we gotta be ready. Out here, you don't get second chances." That night, Eli checked his rifles and loaded his revolvers. He patched the barn doors as best he could, secured the horses, and set up a small fire in the corner to keep Mary warm while remaining low enough not to attract attention. Mary watched him, her hands trembling slightly, but she said nothing. She had come to understand that Eli's calm was not the absence of fear, it was the presence of control. Around midnight, a faint noise drifted on the wind, a horse's hoofs striking snow in a steady rhythm, someone moving with purpose. Eli crouched near the barn door, eyes narrowed. The shadow approached, tall and familiar. Tom Hasker, hat low, whip dangling, boots crunching the frozen earth. "Mary," Tom shouted, his voice cutting across the silent prairie. "You're coming home?" Eli stepped forward, hand resting lightly on the stock of his rifle. "She ain't going anywhere with you," Tom sneered. "You can't stop me, Carter. This is my land, my right, my wife." Eli's jaw tightened. "She's no one's property, Tom, least of all yours." The two men faced each other across the snow, the tension so thick it seemed to make the air itself crack. Then, without warning, Tom lunged toward the barn. His horse reared, throwing clumps of snow, and the world seemed to erupt into chaos. Eli fired a warning shot, the echo bouncing across the valley. "Back off, Hasker. You don't want to do this." Tom hesitated, sneer faltering for just a moment. But anger is a powerful fuel, and he spurred his horse again. Eli had no choice but to meet him, guiding Mary to stay low behind the barn. She clutched the blanket. Fear and adrenaline tangled together. The two men circled the barn, horses pawing snow, eyes locked in a silent standoff. Eli knew he couldn't let Tom break in. If he did, Mary would have no chance. He also knew that in this land, a fight wasn't always won with brute strength, it was won with patience, strategy, and knowing the terrain. Eli led Tom's horse toward a shallow ditch hidden under snow, a trick he had used before to corral runaway cattle. Tom's horse stumbled, throwing him to the ground with a cry of frustration. Eli didn't celebrate. He dismounted immediately, rifle still raised, and stepped between Tom and the barn. "You're done, Hasker," Eli said firmly. "Go back to your place, and you leave her alone. Out here, we settle things with sense, not rage." Tom rose slowly, cursing, spit frothing at the corners of his mouth. He glared at Eli one last time, hatred burning in his eyes, then mounted his horse and disappeared over the ridge, leaving a cloud of snow in his wake. Eli lowered his rifle and returned to the barn. Mary ran to him, relief flooding her face. "Is he gone?" "For now," Eli said. "But this land, it don't forget, neither do people like him." Mary wrapped herself around Eli, shivering from more than just the cold. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Eli rested his hand on her shoulder, feeling the weight of responsibility heavier than any rifle or saddlebag. "You're stronger than you know, and we'll get through this, together." Outside, the wind carried the echo of distant hooves fading into the snow. For now, the immediate danger had passed. But in the West, peace is always temporary, and shadows on the horizon often return when you least expect them. The storm wasn't over, and Eli knew Tom Hasker's anger would not easily be forgotten. But he also knew that Mary had taken her first step toward freedom, and he would ride any length of prairie to keep it that way. The days that followed Tom Hasker's retreat brought a fragile calm over Eli Carter's ranch. The prairie seemed to exhale after the storm, the snow glittering under the bright winter sun. Birds, rare as they were in this cold, chirped cautiously, and the horses moved with relaxed hooves instead of nervous stamping. For the first time in weeks, Eli allowed himself a deep breath. Mary had settled into a rhythm with the ranch chores. She fed the horses, stacked firewood, and even began learning to ride with more confidence. Each day, Eli saw her shoulders straighten a little more, her green eyes shine brighter, and her hands grow steadier. Out here, survival demanded skill and grit, and Mary had begun to show both. One morning, as the sun crept over the ridge, Eli watched Mary working by the barn. Her breath rose in white clouds, her hands steady as she hauled hay to the stalls. There was something in the way she moved, cautious but determined, that made Eli feel a flicker of hope he hadn't allowed himself in months. "You're gettin' strong," he called across the snow, his voice carrying in the crisp air. Mary glanced up, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "I've got a good teacher." Eli chuckled. "That you do. Don't forget, though this place is still unforgiving. One slip and well, best not to think about it." She laughed softly, a sound that reminded Eli of the warm days before the snow, when the prairie smelled of grass and dust instead of frostbite and fear. As the days passed, they worked side by side, tending to the horses, mending fences, and patching the barn doors against winter's bite. It wasn't much a simple life of survival, but it was theirs. Mary learned quickly, and Eli found himself surprised by her resilience. She carried a quiet strength beneath her delicate exterior, one he had underestimated at first glance. One evening, after the chores were done, Eli and Mary sat by the fire in the barn. Outside, the wind whispered through the cracks, but inside, the warmth of the fire and their shared silence created a haven. "Do you think he'll come back?" Mary asked quietly, her hands folded in her lap. Eli leaned back against the wall, watching the flickering flames. "Maybe, but if he does, we'll be ready. Ain't just about fighting him off, it's about knowing the land, knowing each other, and standing firm." Mary nodded, her eyes reflecting both fear and determination. I feel safer here than I ever did at the Hasker place." Eli's gaze softened. "Good, that's how it ought to feel. You don't deserve fear, Mary. Not out here, not anywhere." A rare smile touched her lips, and for a moment, the weight of the past seemed to lift. They sat together in silence, the crackle of the fire filling the space where words weren't needed. But in the West, peace is never permanent. The wind whispered of dangers yet to come, of rustlers' bitter winters, and the one man who had yet to accept that he had lost. Eli knew the quiet was only a prelude, a chance to gather strength before the inevitable storm. Over the next few days, they prepared quietly. Eli reinforced the barn doors, set traps along the perimeter, and ensured the horses were well fed and ready for flight if needed. Mary assisted, eager to learn, and her presence lent an unexpected sense of hope to the hard, relentless days. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky bled red over the prairie, Eli rode a perimeter check with Mary following on foot. They paused at the ridge overlooking the valley, the shadows stretching long and haunting across the snow. "You ready for whatever comes?" Eli asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. Mary looked out across the frozen plains. Green eyes, sharp lips pressed in a firm line. "I am," she said. "I won't run this time." Eli nodded, pride swelling in his chest. "Good cause out here. We face it together, always together." For a moment, the world seemed still, the prairie holding its breath with them. The snow sparkled like diamonds. The horses snorted in contentment. And the wind carried no threat, just the calm before the storm. But Eli knew better. The West didn't forgive. And Tom Hasker, bitter and relentless, would not forget the humiliation of being outsmarted by a man who valued honor over fear. The quiet was deceptive. Shadows loomed beyond the horizon, waiting for the right moment to strike. And Eli, hardened by years on the prairie, understood that the coming battle would test everything: courage, loyalty, and the fragile new life he had promised to protect. As they rode back to the barn, the last light of day fading, Eli couldn't help but glance at Mary. Despite the dangers ahead, he felt a rare, unshakable certainty. Whatever the West threw at them, they would face it together. The storm was coming, and the West was about to remind them that peace is always temporary. But for now, Eli and Mary had carved a quiet life, a brief, precious respite before the shadows returned. The wind had shifted, carrying with it the scent of smoke and the faint metallic temps of horses' sweat. Eli Carter sensed it before he saw it, the telltale signs of someone riding hard across the snow. Deep hoofprints cutting through the fresh powder, the crunch of snow over frozen ground. He was in the barn, checking the horses for any lingering frostbite when Mary appeared at the doorway, her eyes wide. "Eli, someone's coming. I can see them from the ridge." Eli squinted against the low winter sun. A single rider emerged from the distant horizon, hat pulled low, whip coiled and glinting in the light. Tom Hasker. Every muscle in Eli's body tensed. This was no idle threat. The man had come back for what he believed was his right. "Stay inside." "Mary," Eli said calmly, though his pulse hammered like a drum. "Keep the door locked and the fire low. Don't let him see where we are." Mary hesitated, then nodded, moving quickly but silently. Eli mounted his horse, feeling the familiar weight of rifle and revolver. The wind tugged at his coat, carrying snow across his face, and he let the moment stretch, reading the terrain, the ridge ahead, the shallow gullies, the frozen creek bed. All of it could be used to his advantage. Tom's horse thundered closer, the rider shouting obscenities that echoed across the frozen plains. "Carter, hand her over. She's mine." Eli guided his horse to a narrow path that ran along the ridge, keeping the low sun behind him. "Not today, Hasker," he shouted back. "You ride into my land, you'll get more than you bargained for." Tom's horse lunged, charging through the snow. Eli fired a warning shot, and the bullet struck a tree just inches from Tom's head, splintering wood and snow alike. The sudden crack made Hasker rein in his horse. A momentary hesitation Eli needed. The two men circled each other like predators. Snow sprayed as hooves kicked up powder, the wind carrying their shouts. This wasn't just a fight, it was a clash of wills, of honor versus entitlement, of protection versus cruelty. Eli guided his horse into a frozen creek bed, knowing the ice would hold his weight but not Tom's horse if he got reckless. Tom charged, whip raised, shouting curses that would have made the devil itself blush, but Eli was ready. When Tom's horse struck the thin ice, the animal slipped, plunging partially into the cold water. Tom was thrown violently to the snow, face first, soaking in freezing water. Eli dismounted, rifle ready, boots crunching in the icy snow. "I told you, Hasker," he said, voice low and steady. "Out here, you don't take what ain't yours." Tom scrambled to his feet, spitting snow and water, rage burning his features. But now the fire in him met the calm in Eli, and he realized brute force wouldn't win this fight. He glared one last time before retreating toward his horse, slipping, stumbling, and finally mounting with trembling hands. "You'll regret this, Carter," Tom shouted over the wind, horse skidding through the snow as he galloped away. "This ain't over." Eli watched him disappear over the horizon, hooves kicking snow into the fading light. He lowered his rifle and exhaled slowly, every muscle in his body shaking from tension and relief. He had faced storms before. But this one was different. It had threatened everything he had sworn to protect. Back at the barn, Mary ran out, cheeks flushed from fear and cold. Is he gone? Eli nodded, brushing snow from his coat. For now, but he'll remember this. And if he comes back? He looked into her eyes, letting her feel the weight of his determination. We'll be ready. Mary embraced him, shivering but safe. I thought he'd take me again, she whispered. You're stronger than you think, Eli said, his voice soft but firm. And you've got someone who won't let it happen. That night, as the stars burned cold and bright over the prairie, Eli and Mary sat by the fire. The wind howled outside, rattling the barn doors. But inside, there was warmth and safety. For the first time, Mary felt a deep sense of trust and belonging, while Eli felt the rare, quiet satisfaction of having kept someone safe in a world that didn't care for mercy. The West was harsh, and danger would always return. But for now, they had one. And in a land that demanded courage and grit. That victory, small and fragile, was worth every frozen muscle and pounding heart. The storm had passed, but Eli knew Tom Hasker would return one day. The fight wasn't over, but Mary's new life had begun, and with it, the promise of hope in the relentless, unforgiving West. The first light of morning spilled over the ridge, painting the snow-covered prairie with streaks of gold and crimson. The wind had softened overnight, carrying a quiet promise through the air. For Eli Carter, dawn was more than a new day, was a chance to rebuild, to shape the life he had fought so hard to protect. Mary stood at the edge of the barn, her breath rising in white clouds as she watched the sun climb. She had become stronger, more confident, and even the harsh winter had not broken her. For the first time, she felt a sense of ownership over her own life. This land, wild and relentless, had transformed from a place of fear into a place of possibility. Eli joined her, saddling one of the horses. You ready for a ride? He asked, a rare grin breaking through his rugged features. Mary nodded, her green eyes bright. I think I am. The two rode out across the valley, the snow crunching beneath hooves. The horses moved with measured steps, ears flicking toward the rising sun, as if they, too, understood the significance of this morning. It was more than a ride, it was a declaration. They were survivors of the harsh West, and they had claimed their place within it. As they rode, the events of the past weeks lingered like ghosts. Tom Hasker had threatened, pursued, and tried to dominate, but his anger had been outmatched by Eli's resolve and Mary's courage. Every bruise, every frozen night, every moment of fear had forged something stronger in both of them. They reached a gentle rise overlooking the barn, the horses nuzzling the snow as if sensing a pause in the world's chaos. Eli looked at Mary, a mixture of pride and relief in his eyes. You've done well, he said quietly. Better than I could have hoped. Mary smiled softly, her lips tinged with the warmth of newfound confidence. I couldn't have done it without you, she admitted. You taught me how to survive. But I think I've learned more than that. I've learned to fight for myself. Eli's gaze softened, and he nodded. That's the West for you. It'll either break you or make you stronger. You chose the latter. They rode back toward the barn, the snow sparkling under the full sun now. Inside, they began the day's chores, moving in sync with the rhythm of life on the prairie. The barn smelled of hay and leather, warm fires and promise. Each task, simple as it was, felt like a victory over the fear that had once haunted Mary. By afternoon, Eli and Mary worked together repairing a fence that had been damaged by winter storms. Their hands moved with purpose, the familiar tension of labor replaced by companionship. When the last post was set and the fence stood firm, they stepped back, breathing heavily, smiles of satisfaction crossing their faces. Mary looked at Eli. Do you think we can really start over? Leave all the past behind? Eli wiped the sweat from his brow, watching the sun dip toward the horizon. Ain't easy. The West don't forgive everything, and some scars stick. But this land, we can make it ours. We can decide what comes next, not fear. For the first time in what felt like forever, Mary felt the weight of fear lift. She had a choice now. She could live in terror, or she could embrace the life she had fought to protect. And for the first time, she chose freedom. That evening, they stood outside the barn, watching the last light fade across the endless plains. The horizon was vast and unyielding, but it no longer felt threatening. The prairie, once a place of danger and uncertainty, had become their home. Their new beginning was not just a promise, it was a reality they had carved with grit, courage, and trust. Eli placed a hand on Mary's shoulder. Whatever comes, we face it together, he said. Mary nodded, leaning into him. Together, she echoed. The stars began to appear, glittering over the prairie like 1,000 watchful eyes. The wind was calm now, carrying only the scent of pine, snow, and a future that was theirs to write. For Eli and Mary, the West was no longer a place of fear, it was a place of possibility. A land where a new dawn promised hope, strength, and the chance to live life on their own terms. And as the night settled over the barn, over the horses, over the vast, wild prairie, one truth remained unshakable: no matter the storms, no matter the shadows that once haunted them, Eli and Mary had claimed their place in the West. Together, they were free. The long cold winter had ended. The West was still harsh, but for the first time, Eli and Mary faced it not as victims, but as survivors and as partners, in a life they had forged with courage and hope.